Liar. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Friday, December 29th, 2023. This is the last show of the year, and good riddance. Except that I don't know that 2024 is going to be any better, necessarily. It'll be an election year. It'll be crazier. That's for sure. And, of course, we'll all have to try and pretend we still need to figure out whether or not Donald Trump is an insurrectionist or not, and if he ought to be banned from the ballot or just simply imprisoned for his role in January 6th. Gee whiz, I can't figure out where we're going to come down on this thing. There's more developments in all of this. Good news coming in of sorts from Maine, where they have become the latest state to take affirmative action, if you will, like that, in removing Trump from the ballot, although the action hasn't been taken yet and it's been stayed pending judicial review. But thanks to Bill in Portland, Maine, for stepping up and banning Donald Trump from the ballot there. It wasn't Bill. Don't protest at Bill's house. But we'd like to credit him for it anyway, and it seems like the sort of thing that he would like to try to do for us if it were within his power. But actually, the Secretary of State in Maine has made a determination due to the self-executing nature, I suppose, of the 14th Amendment's Section 3. However, very, sensibly and cautiously stayed the decision pending some sort of judicial review in Maine. No action was necessary yet, and so nothing was going to happen at the moment anyway, so, no big deal that the decision has stayed. And, of course, for all the hand-wringers out there, and maybe this was a sop to, you don't want to give Susan Collins a heart attack necessarily, but, this way there'll be some judicial hand in all of this, even though it's not apparently technically necessary. But they'll have that opportunity. There's a couple of stories about it, and as a matter of fact, the latest from the New York Times, which I can grab for this, and I've got the Washington Post's story about it, but and something directly from the Maine Secretary of State's office. In fact, the lengthy decision, and they had to, by the way, consider multiple challenges to Trump's eligibility on different grounds. Not all of them were on the grounds of the 14th Amendment's Section 3, and not all of them with the same reasoning. And actually probably worth taking a look at, just to mention what the other grounds were. But I'll use the New York Times article because they also have updated it to indicate that there is more activity on this front. California and their Secretary of State, they've made a decision as well, and they've actually gone in the other direction, which is interesting and not likely to make a great deal of difference. One of the things you need to remember, of course, in the early stages here, I don't know how much difference it's going to make. Colorado and Maine, Colorado not likely to go into the Trump column anyway, so the electoral votes weren't likely available to him anyway, whether he's on the ballot or not. Not that he'd be beyond forging electoral certificates and pretending he won, but, because that's what he did in 2020. Not in Colorado, but not in New Mexico either, but he did it anyway. So, there's some weird possibilities out there. But also in Maine, unlikely to, can't score any sort of big electoral victory there because there just aren't that many electoral votes available from Maine. And though they do split their votes between the congressional districts, and that sometimes makes one electoral vote available to Trump or the Republicans, it's not that big of a deal, and it won't be dispositive one way or the other. I don't think, although every electoral vote certainly counts in as much as every vote counts. So anyway, it should be interesting. California, almost certainly beyond reach for Trump, but it also likely won't matter. So whether he's on the ballot or not, the electoral vote's unlikely to go into his column. However, You got to keep up with all of these developments. So the New York Times reports it under the headline of Maine joins Colorado in finding Trump ineligible for primary ballot. And then I guess the update comes in the subheader here. Maine found Donald Trump ineligible to hold office because of his actions after the 2020 election. California said his name would remain on the ballot there. So the piece is illustrated with a photo of Shenna Bellows. Is that the right name? Shenna Bellows, Maine's Secretary of State, though the photo was taken in January. I don't know whether there was no photo op involved with this one or not. And I can imagine why they might not have gone the splashiest route, because Donald Trump is on his mob boss thing again and is using his social media platform to very slyly not say anything in particular, just tweeting links to the Secretary of State's bio page from the official website with a sort of a understood wink, wink, you know what to do. And of course, that has resulted in the usual round of death threats, bomb threats, etc., being targeted toward the Secretary of State, Shenna Bellows. So, all right, I guess we all supposed to sit around and say, well, gee whiz, what are you going to do? He didn't say to do anything. So it's just weird that every time a decision goes against him somewhere and he names a person that he believes is responsible for that decision, people just begin making spontaneous death threats out of loyalty to him. And a pattern has been established, and that could be introduced. And of course, I mean, it is a big concern, right? He never actually says, I mean, I don't know how well this is going to work. Like in TV and the movies, they tell you that the mob bosses really believe that just not saying go kill that guy will get them off the hook. It makes it, I guess, slightly more groundwork necessary to convince a jury. But I mean, the juries are allowed to make conclusions from this. They're instructed as much. And if you think that there's something going on here, that 50 times in a row, people who have made decisions adverse to Donald Trump, who have then been named by him on social media, and then all 50 of them receive death threats, if you think that's significant, you can reach the conclusion that he's, with a wink and a nod doing this stuff, and that he has reason to know that that's what's going to be triggered when he does something like this. And you can sentence him for that. So despite the fact that in the movies they try to take great care not to say anything, all it is an effort not to give them evidence that will make the case an open and shut one. Instead, you have to explain to a jury, here's all the things that happened, here's the pattern that occurs over and over and over again without fail, and yes, here's the law that says you're allowed to draw a conclusion from that the person actually wanted this to happen and coordinated it happening. And the act of simply repeatedly putting out the same notice to everyone, knowing what the results are going to be, should be enough for you. And if it is, let us know. And then they do. Anyway, so back up to the hard news here from Maine, like Poland spring water, coming to you straight from Maine. That jingle is forever in my head. And Jenna Russell, Ernesto Londoño, and Sean Hubler, H-U-B, Hubler perhaps, H-U-B-L-E-R, just one B, so we're not sure what to make of it. But Sean, you can chime in and let us know if you feel like it. Okay, well, at any rate, they have updated their piece as of 5 this morning, so hard at work in the wee hours. Maine on Thursday became the second state to bar Donald J. Trump from its primary election ballot after its top election official ruled that the former president's efforts to remain in power after the 2020 election rendered him ineligible to hold office again. Hours later, her counterpart in California announced that Mr. Trump would remain on the ballot in the nation's most populous state, where election officials have limited power to remove candidates. The official in Maine, Secretary of State Shenna Bellows, wrote in her decision that Mr. Trump did not qualify for the ballot because of his role in the January 6th attack on the Capitol. A handful of citizens had challenged his eligibility, claiming that he had incited an insurrection. He did, and was thus barred from seeking the presidency again under the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. I am mindful that no Secretary of State has ever deprived a presidential candidate of ballot access based on Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. I am also mindful, however, that no presidential candidate has ever before engaged in insurrection, Ms. Bellows, a Democrat, wrote. Well, she's right about that. Ms. Bellows' decision follows a Colorado Supreme Court ruling, as you know, last week to keep Trump off the state's Republican primary ballot. The decisions in Maine and Colorado underscore national tensions over democracy, ballot access, and the rule of law, if you've ever heard of that one. They also add urgency to calls for the United States Supreme Court to insert itself into the politically explosive dispute over Trump's eligibility. Stephen Chung, a spokesman for the Trump campaign, said Thursday night that both the Maine and Colorado rulings were partisan election interference efforts that were hostile assaults on American democracy. A hostile assault. Okay. Just weeks, they're part of the same coordinated hostile assault in his view. Just weeks before the first votes in the 2024 election are set to be cast. Oh my God. Lawyers on both sides are asking the nation's top court to provide guidance on an obscure clause. Maybe you've heard of it. It's called the 14th Amendment. Enacted after the Civil War, which is at the heart of the effort to block Mr. Trump from making a third White House run. Courts in two other states, Minnesota and Michigan, have ruled that election officials cannot prevent the Republican Party from including Mr. Trump on their primary ballots. No word yet on what they think about the general election. Michigan's Supreme Court concluded on Wednesday that an appeals court had properly decided that political parties should be able to determine which candidates are eligible to run for president in the primary, is really needs to be said there. Another court decision is expected in Oregon, where the same group that filed the Michigan lawsuit is also seeking to have the courts remove Trump from the ballot there, though Oregon's Secretary of State declined to remove him in response to an earlier challenge. In California, Secretary of State Shirley Weber, a Democrat, had faced a Thursday deadline to certify the list of official candidates so that the local elections officials could begin preparing ballots for the upcoming election. She had indicated in recent days that she was inclined to keep Trump on the ballot based on her interpretation of California law, despite a late request from the lieutenant governor to explore ways to remove him. The legal cases are based, as you know, on a Reconstruction-era constitutional amendment that was intended to bar Confederate officials from serving in the U.S. government. You know all about it. Do we need to read you this part? Probably not. You know about that part of the controversy. Ms. Bellows, the official in Maine charged with considering the petition in that state, is the state's first female Secretary of State and a former state senator. She is also the former executive director of the nonprofit Holocaust and Human Rights Center in Maine and of the American Civil Liberties Union of Maine. Interesting mix of work there. In her 34-page decision, Ms. Bellows wrote that Mr. Trump's petition to appear on the Maine ballot was invalid because he falsely declared on his candidate consent form that he was qualified to hold the office of president. She found that he was not, she wrote, because the record establishes that Mr. Trump, over the course of several months and culminating on January 6, 2021, used a false narrative of election fraud to inflame his supporters and direct them to prevent the peaceful transfer of power. She also concluded that Trump was aware of the likelihood for violence and at least initially supported its use, given he both encouraged it with incendiary rhetoric and took no timely action to stop it. Legal experts say the scope of the Supreme Court decision on the issue would determine if these challenges will be quickly handled or play out for months. A ruling that Mr. Trump, that his conduct cannot be construed as a violation of the 14th Amendment would effectively shut down challenges pending in several states. That hasn't happened, of course, but we'll see. A narrower ruling on the Colorado case could allow Mr. Trump to remain on the state's primary ballot while giving lawyers challenging his eligibility a chance to argue that he should be kept off the general election ballot. The petitioners in Maine included Ethan Strimling, a former mayor of Portland. Hey, Bill, you know that guy? Is he all right? Ethan Strimling, worth hanging out with. Former mayor of Portland and a Democratic state legislator who filed that challenge, along with two other former Maine lawmakers. Secretary Bellows showed great courage in her ruling, and we look forward to helping her defend her judicious and correct decision in court, they said in a statement on Thursday. No elected official is above the law or our Constitution, and today's ruling reaffirms this most important of American principles. We hope. All right. Trump can appeal the Bellows decision to Maine's Superior Court within 5 days. The clock is ticking. Her order would not go into effect until the court rules on an appeal, which the Trump campaign says it intends to file soon. The Republican primaries in Maine and Colorado are both scheduled for March 5th, known as Super Tuesday. Why? Well, you know why, because so many states hold primaries that day. That's not that super, in my view, but okay. The challenges to Trump's ballot access have been brought in more than 30 states in recent weeks. I don't know if I knew that number. Largely through the courts, but because of a quirk in Maine's constitution, registered voters there must first file a petition with the Secretary of State. That's how she comes into the picture. Bellows heard arguments on 3 such petitions on December 15th. Are they going to discuss the weird one? I might have to go to her ruling for that one. After the Colorado decision, lawyers for Trump argued in new Maine filings that the Colorado ruling should be irrelevant there because the 2 states had different laws and standards and because Trump did not have a fair opportunity to litigate the facts in Colorado. Boo-hoo. They also maintained that the Secretary of State lacked the authority to exclude him from the ballot, and that just doesn't appear to be true. The Constitution reserves exclusively to the Electoral College and Congress the power to determine, they say, whether a person may serve as president. Richard Hansen, professor of law at the University of California in Los Angeles, UCLA to you and me, and an election law expert, and someone frequently quoted on this show, said the Maine decision illustrated the power of the Colorado court ruling to ease the way for similar decisions. That's certainly a good point. It takes a lot of courage to disqualify a major candidate, but once the Colorado court did it and thrust the issue into the public light, it became easier for others. Given the incredible complexity of the legal questions involved, said Mr. Hansen, the U.S. Supreme Court is best equipped to resolve the issues. If the court opts not to disqualify Mr. Trump, its decision would not be binding for Congress, but it would make it politically very difficult for Congress to say something different, he said. In California, Democrats have overwhelming control of government, so the state might have seemed a likely venue for a ballot challenge similar to the one that was successful in Colorado, but legal experts said that California, unlike many other states, does not explicitly give its Secretary of State the authority to disqualify presidential candidates. Nonetheless, Lieutenant Governor Eleni Kounalakis, I don't believe I've never heard the name of the Lieutenant Governor of California before, but I guess that's the case. But a Democrat asked Ms. Weber last week to explore every legal option to remove Trump from the ballot using the same constitutional justification cited by the Colorado court. In response, Ms. Weber suggested last week that she planned to leave the question up to state and federal courts, which have already dismissed at least 2 lawsuits in the state challenging Trump's qualifications. So, not a great outlook there, but Weber wrote that she was obligated to address ballot eligibility questions within legal parameters and in a way that transcends political divisions. Okay, good luck with that one. Governor Gavin Newsom indicated last week that he did not believe officials in his state should remove Trump from the ballot. There is no doubt that Donald Trump is a threat to our liberties and even to our democracy, but in California, we defeat candidates we don't like at the polls, he said in a statement. Not a great one. Everything else is a political distraction. But at least when you have overwhelming confidence in your ability to do that, I guess you can lean on that. But not helpful to the larger effort to say, well, you know, some things are in fact undemocratic, but we enshrine those in the Constitution for a reason, because to do otherwise would be dangerous to democracy as a whole. The undemocratic part is leaving it up to, it wouldn't be undemocratic to leave it up to the voters all the time. It would be undemocratic, though, to say, well, we have a constitution and this is how you ratify it, and you need to gather supermajorities in support of it, and they have done so and have won ratification of these constitutional amendments. But we're going to ignore that democracy in favor of this lesser democracy later on. Doesn't seem to make a great deal of sense. You know, to get supermajorities in Congress and supermajorities in or a number of working majorities put together across multiple states at a minimum. That, to me, you know, to say, well, we're going to overrule that with a bare majority later on doesn't seem to make a great deal of sense to me. not particularly democratic after all. Okay. So I mentioned to you that there was another weird challenge here. Is there a brief write-up anywhere of this? Probably not. Well, I might have to take a look at the Maine Secretary of State's actual decision in the case. But I don't know. Skimming through the whole thing is rather time consuming. Well, one interesting thing that jumped right out at me was that one of the first challenges considered was filed by one Mary Ann Royal. I don't know whether she too is a state legislator or not, but what I found interesting, right up in the first paragraph of the decision here is the reference to the challenge filed by Mary Ann Royal, and then it is noted parenthetically that this hereinafter will be referred to as the Royal Challenge. I thought that was pretty. The Royal Challenge to his appearance on the ballot. Get it? I understand. Then, of course, there was someone else filed another one. Kimberly Rosen, along with Thomas Saviello and Ethan Strimling, are all together the Rosen Challenge, and all three of them together the Rosen Challengers. There's also one from Paul Gordon. So there's a Gordon Challenge, a Rosen Challenge, and of course the Royal Challenge, which makes me think of the game that they advertise incessantly in the in-game advertisements in my solitaire game on my phone, constantly being barraged by the push for, it's Royal Match is the name of that game. And they have very formulaic advertising, so it's brought a lot of good jokes to mind. But none of them will be made here because they're all very boring. But I have to come clean with you. I have not been considering the Royal Challenge, but I'm going to start. It takes my mind off everything. Has everybody else seen those ads? I don't know where else they advertise. I assume they're blasting the internet with these advertisements in all sorts of games. Anyway, one of these things, and was it maybe the Gordon one? I can't remember offhand. And I think I saw this maybe if I search, the things I repeated on social media yesterday, I might see the one that I am thinking of. But somebody said that one of these challenges was actually based on, not on the 14th Amendment, but interestingly enough on the 22nd Amendment, which seemed like fun, but I was glad to see somebody actually make mention of it. The 22nd Amendment, do I have it right? Let's pull the document here. But the 22nd Amendment, yes, is the one that says that no person shall be elected to the office of the president more than twice, right? Term limits for the presidency, that is to say, limited to those 2 elected terms. And, you probably see where this is going, right? Somebody was basically saying, listen, he won in 2016, sort of, kind of, but we all pretended that he did and we all recognized that he did. Then he went around and has gone around since claiming to have won in 2020 as well. And while nobody recognizes him as president, and you might think that undermines the case, this person's argument was, well, he's making a statement contrary to his interest here. He's been the one insisting that he won the election in 2020. And if you're trying to get yourself on the ballot at the same, for a third run at the same time that you're saying everywhere else in public, telling people you did win the second one, well, that's an admission against interest, and we'll take it at face value. And therefore, you're disqualified from the ballot for 2024 because of the admission you made. I mean, it's not our fault that you've been unable to get the rest of the country to recognize your win. And, of course, too clever by half and rejected. But I'm not certain whether that was Gordon or whether that only the Rosen, Gordon, and Royal challenges made challenges on grounds that were accepted by the Secretary of State, and that some fourth challenge was rejected. But I just thought that was interesting to note along the way. So, yeah, I mean, it's probably worth giving a look at this document. It is, in my PDF here, 34 pages, but I assume that the last couple of pages might be just signature pages, etc., or maybe an appendix or something. Because I thought that they gave a different number, but whatever. 34 is what it turns out to be. So there you go. No need to read through the entirety of the thing on the air, but it might make interesting reading later on as people still continue to recommend the Colorado Supreme Court ruling as very easily understood and a lucid explanation for the lay person of exactly what they're doing, not reliant on a lot of hair-splitting and legal mumbo-jumbo. So that's good news. So, something to do over the extended holiday weekend. If you're looking to, I don't know, bore yourself to death, for instance, you could do that. All right, let's see. Other things I wanted to share with you, and we'll start this one, despite the fact that the break is coming up. Maybe I thought we would take a quick look at Vikram David Amar's second installment in his, I guess, mini-series, two-part series, on the bad arguments against the application of Section 3 to Trump. And, that break is coming up a little faster than I imagined. But I think we teased it yesterday by saying, remember, this was the guy that was making the argument against, he was critiquing Larry Lessig's essay saying that the amendment ought not to apply to Trump, but saying so from the perspective of someone who professed to be confused, I guess, as to why senators and representatives would have been listed explicitly in the 14th Amendment's language, but the president and vice president were not, even though the electors for president and vice president were. And the answer was that the phrasing of officers was understood to cover everybody, including the president and vice president, and that senators and representatives, due to the ineligibility clause, were not understood that way. Hi, everybody. It's me, David Waldman. Yes, the same guy who interrupts you all the time. Interrupting you one more time just to tell you again, another reminder that your contributions are what keep this show on the air, and Patreon.com, Patreon.com, is still among the easiest ways to make the sustaining subscription donations that keep us afloat. Are you ready for the pep talk about how our Patreon campaign is still going strong and growing? Well, too bad. Yeah, the plain fact is we actually are headed in the wrong direction, and whereas we once had about 175 monthly patrons, we're now actually down below 150. Time to recruit some more. Not exactly the kind of news I wanted to share, but there it is. For those of you in a position to support the show, Patreon.com does make it easy to make those secure, recurring monthly contributions to do so. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. We've been through a lot together. The worst of the pandemic, we hope. The worst of the insurrection, we hope. So go ahead and treat yourself. You don't need an excuse. Give yourself the gift of a little something you enjoy in life. Support the show. And of course, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running on those options too. So thanks again, everyone, for all your support. We couldn't, or at least shouldn't, do it without you. Hope you'll be on board soon too. Thanks for all your support. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. All right, let's look then back at Vikram David Amar's second approach to dismissing the bad arguments, claiming that the 14th Amendment does not apply to Trump for whatever reason. The second objection here is a non-legal one that I guess was chiefly put forward, or perhaps most annoyingly, maybe, put forward by Ross Douthat in the New York Times column that he still has for whatever reason, which is basically, well, gee whiz, isn't that undemocratic? Isn't it terrible to deny the voters the opportunity to say that they don't want him to be president, as opposed to stepping in and authoritatively saying, oh, it doesn't matter what you want, he's not allowed to run. Well, let's see what this has to say here. In the space below, physically speaking, he says, I addressed this non-legal objection, chiefly put forward by Ross Douthat here. The nub of Douthat's essay is captured by the following passage, and it reads this way. Removing an opposition candidate from the ballot, indeed, a candidate currently leading in some polling averages. That's kind of a weird argument to make, but okay. Pending the economic boom of 2024 that we can all hope is coming, through the exercise of judicial power is a remarkably anti-democratic act. I guess, I don't know whether you're supposed to conclude from this that someone who's trailing in the polls could be barred from the ballot and not offend democracy, but Ross isn't a super thorough thinker in this, and that's the point. It is more anti-democratic than impeachment because the impeachers and convictors, representatives and senators, are themselves democratically elected and subject to swift democratic punishment. It is more anti-democratic than putting an opposition politician on trial because the voters who regard that trial as illegitimate are still allowed to vote for an indicted or convicted politician, as almost 1 million Americans did for Eugene V. Debs while he languished in prison in 1920. Now, on to the analysis. While this point of view has surface plausibility, it quickly falls apart under careful analysis. So let's do some of that, I guess. For starters, put aside the fact that all the members of the Colorado Supreme Court who ruled against Trump had, in fact, been ratified by voters in a judicial retention election. So, well, it's not fair. It's more undemocratic because senators and representatives are elected. Well, so are these judges. I mean, it's not the case necessarily. It's, Colorado is weird and complex. And I guess initially you are nominated to the court, I suppose, by the governor and confirmed to the court. And then after a term of years, you have to stand in a judicial retention election. In other words, your appointment lasts for only so long, after which the voters have to ratify you. And as it happens, everybody on the Colorado Supreme Court has been through that and has been ratified by the voters. So that argument just completely evaporates. That's gone, at least insofar as the Colorado Supreme Court. However, not the case with every Supreme Court in the land, and not the case with our current Supreme Court and the United States federal Supreme Court either. And yet I have a feeling that, for instance, if they were to say no to this, Ross Stathout wouldn't be worried about the anti-democratic aspects of the U.S. Supreme Court. But I suppose we'll all have our chance to find out. Now, that put aside, and effectively so, there's more. Here's a parenthetical note from our author who says that I put that aside because I don't think the state court judges that represent the people of a single state should be able to remove candidates for national office under a provision of the U.S. Constitution such as Section 3, which I take to mean, at first glance, it looks like, well, you can't take them off every ballot in every state just because of what Colorado says, but that's not actually what he's saying. He's saying, well, this really is a question that ought to be settled, I guess, in federal court, that a single, I don't think state court judges that represent the people of a single state should be able to remove candidates for national office. But just in Colorado, is he still opposed to that? It's not entirely clear, but I think that's the sentence construction here. But the U.S. Supreme Court, he goes on to say, which represents the whole nation, sort of, kind of, and is the final word on federal law, would of course be different in this regard. Put aside as well that while a criminal prosecution and punishment of a candidate does not formally prevent people from registering their support for and indeed voting for the convicted candidate, it is far from clear that a candidate who was elected but serving a jail term at the time would be able to discharge the powers and duties of the office. Thus, a criminal prosecution might very well prevent the voters from having their will that a particular person serve as president fully vindicated. So yes, you can cast your ballots for him, but had Eugene V. Debs won the presidency by virtue of winning enough states and therefore the electoral college votes that go with them, and had been, in fact, declared president, it would be very unclear that you could, in fact, discharge the duties of the office from jail, and they may say, yeah, incapacity to serve here, and I suppose at that point it would devolve to the elected vice president, but you couldn't say that you were prevented from voting for him. It's just that person is still ineligible to serve, and in the end doesn't serve. So that's a distinct point, and one worth making. But I put aside these quibbles with Mr. Doubthat's reasoning because there is a much more fundamental flaw in his suggestion that enforcing Section 3 of the 14th Amendment would inevitably be anti-democratic. Enforcement of the Constitution, including Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, is not anti-democratic because... Why? Because we the people, yes, that phrase that people love to tattoo on themselves in some cases. We the people adopted the terms of the Constitution and have not seen fit to change it, either by formal amendment or by less formal but durable majoritarian consensus. If you had asked Americans in 2019 whether Section 3 of the 14th Amendment and its ban on insurrectionists holding high federal office no longer reflects a basic commitment to the kind of government we desire, I doubt you would have anywhere close to a majority of American adults saying yes. More generally, if enforcement of Section 3 is anti-democratic, so would enforcement of other requirements for federal office holding be. I guess so would be other. Okay, well anyway, would it be undemocratic to deny a popular non-citizen access to the presidential ballot because a president must be a natural-born citizen? Would it be anti-democratic to deny a popular 17-year-old rock star access to the presidential ballot because a president must be at least 35 years old? New variants of old arguments, of course. And by the way, how about Edward Snowden for president? Is it okay if he runs from exile in Russia after having absconded there rather than face charges for espionage here in the United States? I mean, no one would disqualify him, right? That would be anti-democratic. Well, anyway, there are other examples here. What about to move away from presidential qualifications? Imagine 80% of America wanted to shut down the New York Times and Mr. Doubthat's column with it. Now, that may actually be true. Would it be anti-democratic, though, to prevent such a result because censorship of this kind is forbidden by the First Amendment? This is essentially a restatement of what I had been saying in the last couple of weeks, that, the Constitution is where you enshrine things that are otherwise anti-democratic but somehow ratified as necessary for the preservation of the Republic. Places where you put provisions that you could easily see falling victim to populist whims, but which you want to protect from populist whims and make it extraordinarily difficult to attack these exercises of basic rights. So, one of the basic rights, I guess, is the right to of self-defense against people who would wreck this order. If you can't be trusted to uphold the constitutional order, you can't ask to enjoy its benefits. And not all of them, anyway, and certainly not the ones that entitle you to be in a position where you can offer your own interpretation and or enforcement of it. The presidency and other offices under the United States are not available to you. Are the free speech rights available to you? Yes. Freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, yes, sure. Right to the penumbras of privacy, sure, that too, until the Supreme Court takes those away. All the rest of the rights are available to you, but holding office and passing on the validity of the rest of the Constitution, those are the things that are being denied you. And rightfully so. Indeed, if enforcement of all of these clear provisions of the Constitution would be anti-democratic, so would all judicial review. In fact, to say that because Mr. Trump is popular and indeed leading in the polls, maybe, it would be anti-democratic to prevent him from being eligible for the presidency is simply to ignore the fact that American constitutional democracy, by embodying certain high-minded, deliberate decisions in the supreme law of the land, often prevents passionate, temporary majorities from getting their way. Indeed, if this weren't so, then the presidential election system that Mr. Doubthat seems to want to protect with its odd electoral college apparatus would itself be anti-democratic. And people did complain that it was. And thus the suggestion from Mr. Doubthat is illegitimate. The reason for the Electoral College, even though it can lead to and has led to candidates with fewer votes than an opponent winning the White House, is democratically legitimate, is that it is codified in the Constitution itself, and that codification has not been changed through formal or circumvented through informal legal devices. Now that Mr. Doudhat might mean to take on the very idea of supremacy of the United States Constitution or the institution of judicial review, but if so, he may mean that, but if so, he needs to say a lot more. And if he concedes the general legitimacy of judicial enforcement of the Constitution, he needs to explain why Section 3 is somehow an exception to the rule. Given all this, the question becomes not whether Section 3 is anti-democratic when it is properly triggered, but instead whether the requirements of Section 3 have in fact been satisfied. That is where the analytic action should be, and here Mr. Doudhat does make plausible, but not necessarily winning, arguments that Section 3's triggering conditions have not been met. Indeed, one could build on what Mr. Doudhat says here to argue that before we apply Section 3 to an office like the presidency, we should be very clear that its requirements have been met, just as the reasoning behind supermajority rules like the filibuster is that consensus is prudent when certain kinds of important decisions are involved. But we must be careful to distinguish those kinds of prudential arguments from the much more careless removing an opposition candidate from the ballot. Indeed, a candidate currently leading in some polling averages, as Doudhat says, through the exercise of judicial power is inherently a remarkably anti-democratic act type of language. That latter kind of language and reasoning undermines rather than promotes what democracy means in America's distinctive constitutional system. Pretty good. Even though some of it rests on claiming the legitimacy of the filibuster, which is highly questionable, but and of course not enshrined in the Constitution at all anywhere, and so perhaps inapplicable. But another example, certainly, of something that is consciously anti-democratic, nonetheless being accepted for better or for worse by informal majoritarian forces. So, okay, a good addition there. Let's see, another interesting addition perhaps to our Friday roundup would be, maybe we'll use this by way of introduction to Rosalyn MacGregor's latest from Ottawa County. I mentioned to you that there was work in the Washington Post, and a lengthy bit at that, and perhaps we'll start that and carry it over into the next segment. A piece by Greg Jaffe from December 23rd, under the headline of, "Can the exhausted, angry people of Ottawa County learn to live together?" Well, it's a good question. Very broad. But this, I think the first that I've seen in terms of national papers taking a look at what's going on there. But I feel like we're insiders in Ottawa County, thanks to Rosalyn's continuing coverage there. The subheader of this piece is Adeline Hambley's employees at a county health department in Michigan. We definitely started off here in the saga of Ottawa County, as Rosalyn's described it to us. But in the health department, her employees saw her as their protection from political interference by conservative Christians on the county board. You know, Impact Ottawa. We learned all about them. Then the board offered her $4 million to quit. That's pretty enticing. Let's see what goes on here. And I don't know if doesn't ring a bell, $4 million to go. But I wouldn't be surprised if we had heard about that among the many entries that Rosalyn has sent along. But just to recap then, if that's the case, all year, new conservatives on the new conservative Christian majority on the Ottawa County Board of Commissioners. All year, they've been searching for a way to get rid of Adeline Hambley, who ran the West Michigan County's health department. It wasn't as easy as it seemed. No doubt they all, of course, campaigned on how easy it would be. And that's the first thing I'll do when I get into office. And lo and behold, it's taken them a year. They had discussed firing Hambley, whom they saw as an instrument of government tyranny. But her job came with protections written into state law that were intended to insulate her from political influence or retribution. They had proposed paying Hambly $4 million to leave, and she accepted in early November. But the commissioners backed out a few days later when they learned that the payment could damage the county's bond rating and tank its finances. You would think that might be a consideration up front, but I guess not. Now it was November 14th. The commissioners huddled with their lawyers in a windowless conference room at the county's boxy brick government complex. As you know, Impact Ottawa is opposed to windows. They're very anti-glass, I guess. I don't know. I made that up. Hambly and her lawyer waited anxiously in a small room just down the hall. The two sides were stuck. All over the country, deep partisan divisions were making it harder for American government to function and its citizens to coexist. The number of intractable disputes seemed to grow by the day. Climate change, racial equality, gender-affirming care, guns, immigration, abortion. The battles were paralyzing Congress and pitting red and blue states against each other. Increasingly, they were consuming school boards and local government. In Ottawa County, a fast-growing community of 300,000 along Lake Michigan, the nexus for so many of these ideological fights was the health department. Foolishly enough, I would add. The hard-right Republicans on the 11-person county board swept into office last year after defeating more moderate GOP incumbents in a primary. The old commissioners had for years focused on keeping taxes low and the country's biggest multinational employers happy. Their replacements reflected an increasingly populist and conspiratorial GOP remade in the image of Donald Trump. They complained that they couldn't trust Hambly. They accused her of supporting mask mandates. Ooh, no, not those that saved so many lives. And pushing coronavirus vaccines that they believed were unproven and possibly unsafe. They said her employees had encouraged dangerous, sexually perverse behavior. How? By attending a local pride festival where they tested attendees for sexually transmitted diseases and administered the Mpox vaccine. Mpox, that's monkeypox, I guess. We're now down to just M. I don't want to insult the monkeys, I guess. Hambly insisted that her job wasn't to serve the board, and it's not. It was her responsibility to look after the health and safety of all of the county's residents, regardless of their moral or political beliefs. I want to work with the commissioners so we can protect the community, said the 44-year-old who had sued the county to keep her position. But I am not their subordinate. Their latest fruitless negotiating session was approaching the 7-hour mark on November 14th when Doug Zylstra, the lone Democrat on the board and a strong backer of Hambly, suggested an option that only a few days later would have seemed unthinkable. What if Hambly and the conservatives on the board tried to negotiate a temporary truce? No one was completely comfortable with the idea, but none of the commissioners rejected it. After a half hour of talks, the commissioners had cobbled together a bare-bones proposal that would allow Hambly to keep her job and pay her about $100,000 to cover her legal fees. Zylstra had Zlistra? Is that right? Zlistra? I don't know. Maybe Rosalyn can help us out with that at some point. Sensed that Hambly would not accept it, she wanted the commissioners to acknowledge her independence and authority as a county health officer. She needed guarantees that they wouldn't bully her staff or simply try to fire her again in a few weeks. Still, Zylstra saw the board's offer as a small step forward, a rare glimmer of hope in an otherwise depressing and divisive year for the board and the county. The stalemate was finally forcing the two sides to wrestle with the question that for 11 months they had been unwilling to even consider. Amid all the rancor, could they somehow figure out a way to live together? Good question. Next section, paying a premium. The driving force behind the year-long effort to remove Hambly was Joe Moss, a 38-year-old newcomer to politics and the board chair. We've heard all about him from Rosalyn over the years. Moss, is it years already? Jeez. Moss rarely talked about the actual work of county government, because he wasn't doing any, repairing roads, maintaining parks, inspecting restaurants, and collecting taxes. Instead, his public statements and social media posts described an epical battle between Christian conservatives and powerful secular forces in the media, academia, government, and the medical establishment that he said were trying to outlaw his faith and seize control of his community. Censorship, demonization, and public intimidation of conservatives have been the go-to method to obtain submission and silence, Moss wrote in the midst of the board's standoff with Hambly and the health department. A few days later, he shared a post that said, "Progressives are working hard to make unapologetic conservative Christianity unacceptable in the public life of our nation. This is absolutely true," he added, in case you thought he might be lying. Moss's posts echoed the messages that he and his constituents were hearing regularly from their pastors on Sundays, and they mirrored the increasingly angry and apocalyptic rhetoric of national Republican leaders like Trump, who described his political enemies as, quote, vermin, often training his ire on the federal bureaucracy and its institutions. "Either the deep state destroys America or we destroy the deep state," the former president said. I forgot to do his voice in that one. In Ottawa County, Moss's battle began with the 100-person health department. Hours after taking office, on January 3rd, Moss and his allies on the board voted to demote Hambly and replace her with Nate Kelly, a safety manager at a local HVAC, or some people just say out all the letters, HVAC, company who had gained prominence as a vaccine skeptic and a critic of mask mandates. We learned about this as well from Rosalyn. The previous Republican-dominated board had appointed Hambly to her position in December of 2022 after a months-long nationwide search. They saw Hambly as a long-serving, reliable county employee. To Moss, she was a cog in a vast and unelected bureaucracy that included the World Health Organization, Yargle Wargle, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. Basically anybody who was looking out for public health anywhere. Bad! Moss declined to comment for this article, but discussed the department's importance in an interview with a local right-wing talk radio host, saying, "In many ways, public health has been weaponized in the United States and outside the country," which is not your concern at all, and really throughout the United States, also not your concern. Ottawa County, remember? Anyway, and that's why we need people who are going to prioritize freedom and the Constitution. We should not have top-down governmental control making daily decisions for hundreds of thousands or millions of people, except in the sense that that's what government does. But hey, never mind that. Hambly sued the board in February to stop the conservative commissioners from demoting or replacing her, so Moss looked for other ways of limiting her and the department's power. In late August, Moss and the county administrator gave Hambly less than 3 days to slash the department's proposed 2024 budget in half, from $17.4 million down to $9 million. The order came despite the county's growing tax revenue and flush coffers. Hambly said she tried to comply, but quickly concluded it was not feasible. In news releases and public statements, she warned that the cuts would damage the county's economy, endanger public safety, and trigger a state takeover of the department. Ironically enough, and I think we did hear about that one. Wouldn't that be something? In your efforts to purge the deep state, the state got even deeper into your business. Moss and the board gradually backed off their most extreme demands. In late September, the commissioners authorized the department to spend $14.4 million in 2024, down about 20% from the previous year's spending. On the night the budget passed, Moss accused Hambly of inciting fear and panic in the community with her warnings and initiated the formal process to fire her. Yeah, you initiated panic in the community by telling them what might happen if their budgets were slashed so drastically. So we're firing you for that, sure. State law required, though, that the board prove in a public hearing that Hambly was, quote, incompetent or had committed malfeasance. Current and former county employees testified over 2 days in late October about the chaotic budget process and the growing political pressure on county workers. When hearing was done, the county's lawyers warned the commissioners that voting to fire Hambly carried risks. A judge could order the county to reinstate her and pay damages. Moss and his allies on the board debated their options for several days before the two sides reconvened on November 6th at the county government center. They first offered Hambly $1.8 million to leave and drop her lawsuit. Hambly and her attorney countered with $8 million, according to court documents. Not bad. The back-and-forth negotiations continued for several hours. Near the end of the day, Hambly and her lawyer said she would take $4.45 million to leave, though she didn't expect the board to accept. The county's lawyers advised the commissioners that the proposed settlement was on the high end of what she might receive if she prevailed at trial. Hambly's annual salary and benefits amounted to about $180,000. Several commissioners who wanted to keep Hambly in the job argued that the offer was exorbitant and unnecessary. A majority of the commissioners, though, wanted her gone. The final decision on the proposed settlement fell to Moss. He had been saying for months that the nation's survival required, quote, unapologetic conservative leaders with spines of steel. Now the moment had arrived for him to show that he was that kind of leader. Moss told the attorneys that he was willing to pay a premium to guarantee Hambly's departure, according to several people in the room. Sylvia Rodea, if I have the name correct, the board's vice chair, suggested one last counter of $4 million and save the extra $450,000, right? Moss agreed, by the way, and soon the lawyers were walking the offer down the hall where Hambly and her attorney were waiting. Next up, a broken deal. Wow, I can't believe it. Hambly had gone to the county government complex on the morning of November 6th, expecting that she would spend the day fighting to keep her job. She wasn't sure what to do when she saw the board's $4 million counteroffer. I don't want to feel like I'm selling my soul in some way, she texted her husband. The daughter of a machinist and a school bus driver, Hambly was the first in her family to graduate from college. She had started with the county 2 decades earlier as a restaurant and septic inspector. Yum. Working her way up to the department's top job while raising 3 children, now ages 19, 17, and 12. That day, her husband was at home, a small, muddy farm with chickens, goats, and a pig named Waffles. That's important to know, a pig named Waffles. Very cute, but okay. Who weighed several hundred pounds, by the way, and slept in their front entryway, which is perhaps charming, but you might also say, what happened to the health inspector in this one? Okay, but she's been promoted at this point, and I guess if you clean it up enough, whatever, it's a private home. Anyway, it's life-changing for our family, she texted him. What do you want me to do? He told her to listen to her lawyer. $4 million in the offering, nothing to sneeze at. Hambly accepted the proposed settlement, and the lawyers began working to finalize the language so that the commissioners could reconvene in a week and vote publicly on it. We'll be right back. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Let's continue with this lengthy Washington Post rundown of news we more or less already knew because Rosalyn MacGregor told us. But it's interesting to see the national perspective on it, and kind of cool to see all of her reporting to us be acknowledged here. Well, all of the facts being acknowledged by a national newspaper, I guess. It's just interesting. I guess there's a little bit more behind the scenes detail. We didn't really learn about the pig's name, for instance, necessarily in all of this, but we concentrated on the more important things. But it's just sort of interesting to see that someone else recognized the national importance of something local like what's going on in Ottawa County, and that it can be happening elsewhere, and that we ought to be looking out for it. Okay. So now we continue with this saga. Again, now the board has offered Hambly $4 million to leave. She didn't think they were actually going to come back with an offer like that. She doesn't know what to do. She wants to stay and fight, and thought she was fighting to remain in her job and continue to be there to protect her employees, etc. But they are offering an outlandish amount of money. It would be, in fact, life-changing. That's true. Well, it doesn't matter, because a few days later, the deal fell apart. The county's lawyers told the board that that large payout could cause its insurer to drop the county's coverage, according to several commissioners who spoke on a condition of anonymity to discuss internal discussions. The county, in turn, could lose its AAA bond rating, driving up the costs that it, along with schools and townships throughout Ottawa, would incur to borrow money. That's real. That's very serious. Like all of a sudden, a $4 million hole in your cash holdings or your obligations is going to make changes like that. The county's lawyers emailed Hambly's attorney on November 10th to say that they had, quote, run into problems with the settlement. On November 14th, everyone returned to the government center for another day of haggling. The board offered Hambly $1 million to quit. That's not a great negotiating move, is it? The maximum its lawyers said the county could give her without putting its bond rating at risk. Hambly rejected it. The board floated Zylstra's idea of a truce. It's not going to, I mean, that's not the ideal conditions to be offering something like that, but what else are you going to do, right? Well, a truce in which the board would pay some of Hambly's legal fees. She would drop her lawsuit and stay in the job without any protections. Well, she turned down that proposal as well. About 4 p.m., the talks ended for the day. Hambly headed to the health department to address her employees, nurses, social workers, health inspectors, and epidemiologists who had packed the office's main conference room. Not packed up their belongings to leave, but had packed the conference room. I thought that's where that was going. Many were wearing T-shirts bearing the slogan, "Nevertheless, she persisted." Remember that? In support of their boss, even though that was originally for Elizabeth Warren and foolish words from Mitch McConnell that rang true nonetheless. Anyway, to support to Moss and his supporters, Hambly was the vanguard of a national movement that was seeking to marginalize and silence Christian conservatives. It's like, what a nut. I don't know. I just had to pause and add that to it. Because, I mean, she's literally at least the way the story is portraying. I'm sure Moss feels differently, but in the real world, it turns out, look, I just want to run the county health department and not be bullied, and I don't want you bullying my staff. If there's a disease, I want to stop it from striking conservatives, Christians, everybody. It doesn't matter. I actually wanted to just do my job without favor to anyone in particular. But of course, that's not enough for conservative Christian types. Well, we're supposed to come first. And if we don't, then you're discriminating against us, is essentially what they're saying. So to Moss and his supporters, Hambly was apparently this vanguard of an international evil, apparently, a cabal set to who would do something as horrific and oppressive as saying, you people aren't special. You should just get health care like everybody else. To employees of the health department, of course, Hambly was their shield. She was fighting not just for them, but for embattled medical professionals across the state and the country. The Holland Sentinel, the local newspaper, had published the details of the $4 million deal a few days earlier, before it had been withdrawn. For the workers in the room, the news that Hambly was willing to take money to leave was a gut punch. Some said they had felt abandoned and betrayed, and you can understand that, right? Hambly told her employees that she had wanted to stay and fight. I would love to keep being the county health officer, she said, but a majority of the commissioners were determined to get rid of her. And, in the face of that, maybe a settlement isn't the worst thing after all. If the board fired her, Hambly told her staff, she probably would have to fight for a year or longer in court before she could return to her job. She was pretty confident that she could, but even if she prevailed, there were no guarantees that a judge would order the board to reinstate her. So it was pretty iffy. Hambly and Marcia Mansoray, maybe I've got that right, her deputy, described the proposed $4 million settlement as a powerful deterrent that would clarify state law and send a message to other county commissions in Michigan that removing a health officer carried huge costs. The employees began to ask questions. They wanted to know who would protect them if both Hambly and Mansoray were gone. Hambly replied that, okay, ready for this one, Gwen Unzicker. Okay, that's not so bad. Unzicker, a physician who served as the department's medical director, would fight to make sure their work met the standards of care. They asked Hambly what she was hearing from the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, which also had an oversight responsibility for the department. Initially, state officials had pressed Hambly to try to, quote, find common ground with the new commissioners. Lately, the response from state officials had been silence, she told workers. So they didn't really have much to do to help there. They asked about this HVAC safety manager, whom the board hoped to put in charge of the department if Hambly departed. There wasn't much she could tell them. The hours-long session was nearing its end. I can't imagine what you're feeling right now, an employee in the medical examiner's office told Hambly. Thank you for being willing to fight for us. Hambly and Mansoray thanked their employees for their perseverance and tenacity. The room burst into applause that lasted for a couple of minutes. That can be kind of annoying after a while, but when the cheering died down, the workers headed home. They described their state of mind in interviews as anxious, uncertain, stressed, and utterly exhausted. Most doubted that Moss or his allies on the board would be willing to seek an acceptable compromise. Eventually, they would find a way to force Hambly out. To them, the stakes are eternal, Unzicker said. There is no middle ground. They seem to think what we're doing is evil. Next section, the fallout grows. News of the scuttled $4 million settlement spread quickly through the county. After hours, or a few hours after Hambly had addressed her staff, the Ottawa County Patriots, oh boy, held a previously scheduled seminar at a local church. It was titled The Second Amendment. What? Why? Under attack and fighting back. But I guess they used it for criticism of the $4 million settlement proposal instead. But don't worry, that isn't the last you'll hear about Ottawa County right-wingers and the Second Amendment today. But Rebecca Curran, one of the new commissioners who had taken office in January, sat in the third pew from the front. She went to the church for this Second Amendment, I don't know what you would call it, the seminar, I guess is what they called it. Interesting, though, that you have to go sit in the pews to hear about the pew, 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 I suppose. But okay. Anyway, when the presentation ended, whatever it might have been about, several attendees circled around her, expressing shock that the county would offer Hambly so much money. Are they actually going to give her $4 million? Asked an older man who wore a Navy veteran cap and balanced on a cane. If you give it to one of them, you open the floodgates to them all, warned a woman with an American flag scarf draped around her neck. Disrespectful, in my view. I can't believe numbers that were like that were even contemplated, said a lawyer in a crisp Oxford shirt and khakis. Also disrespectful, in my view, by the way. Not really to either of those. But anyway, Curran told them that she didn't support the settlement and had planned to vote against it before it fell apart. I don't agree with it, she said, saving her own neck, I suppose. The board had spent more than 30 hours in open and closed session discussing what to do and seemed to have no workable answers. One of the commissioners resigned amid the standoff, citing changes in his personal and professional life. Do we know about this one? It doesn't name the person, so I can't remember whether it rings a bell or not, but the story might. Anyway, 6 of the remaining 10 wanted to remove Hambly. 3 were trying to find a way to keep her. Curran was somewhere in the middle, of course, being pressured by people. I'm so tired of the political games on both sides, she said. I'm so tired that I refuse to take a position, and I'm becoming a middle-of-the-road squish because of how tired I am of all these middle-of-the-road squishes. Whatever. The battle was affecting the health department's ability to keep staff and deliver services. Since the beginning of the year, 24 employees, about a fifth of its workforce, had retired or left for other jobs, according to health department officials. In the 5 years before the pandemic, the department had averaged about 8 departures a year. One of those who quit in November was Matthew Allen, a supervisor in the department's environmental division. He'd been with the county for 14 years and described himself as a devout Christian who homeschooled his children, voted for Trump, and never got a coronavirus vaccine. And he still quit. That's funny. None of that mattered to Hambly, he said. She was a wonderful leader. Right? Didn't hold it against him in the least. And probably considered him a bridge to vaccine-resistant people in the county, not to necessarily convince them to get a vaccine, but to perhaps respect other public health provisions, whether having to do with COVID-19 or not. Like, yeah, you can't just throw restaurant inspectors out. It's actually important to have these health department inspectors come in, and maybe he could help with that. Anyway, Allen said Moss's interference had led him to leave the county for a state job. There's a line between government and religion. What do you know? And when they get mixed up, you don't get people making decisions for the good of the whole, he said. It's actually a reasonable approach. I can't believe it. A Trump supporter at that. His and other departures, I mean, I guess they can believe it now. It's too much to be believed. A Trump supporter could understand the wisdom of public health measures. Thank God we've got him. Oh, we don't have him around anymore. All right, well, how interesting. Anyway, his departure and others from the environmental division was taking a toll, health department officials said. The wait time for septic inspections in the county has tripled since January to 30 days, which no doubt there are people running around saying, stupid bureaucrats, they can't, stupid red tape is holding me up. Why can't I just, And of course, it's your people who are out there attacking red tape and bureaucracy who are creating this red tape and bureaucracy. Anyway, the turmoil has also upended Ottawa Food, a health department program that helped feed 22,000 low-income residents each year. That won't make Trump supporters unhappy. They love it. Except for Matthew Allen, perhaps. The board in the fall had eliminated funding for the program's director, a health department employee who coordinated food assistance with 45 local nonprofits and food pantries. So they were trying to kill it. In November, amid the fight over Hambly's fate, the nonprofits that made up Ottawa Food's board announced that they were suspending a program that provided aid to seniors and an initiative that supplied churches and food pantries with thousands of pounds of fresh produce. So interesting. There go the Christian conservatives meddling in things. And the first thing that happens is it hits the extraordinarily conservative senior population there and the churches in their activities there as well. Yargle bargle, something, freedom. Thanks a lot to the conservative Christians on the board. Rodea, the vice chair of the board, accused the health department and its nonprofit partners of playing a political game with the program. How do you like that? To discredit the commissioners. This was your idea, guys. We're committed to food security in this county, she said, but we're not committed to dysfunction. We're so committed that we will defund the program addressing food security. That's how committed we are. The nonprofits on the Ottawa Food Board received nearly $1 million from the county in 2023 to run food programs and assist farmers. That's how you get those things passed. At a board meeting in late November, Rodea threatened to take some of that money and start a new county agency that would work more cooperatively with the commissioners as opposed to working with the people who actually provide food. Anyway, she didn't explain how the new agency would operate, but she did have a name for it, the Department of Family Impact. I'm tearing up here just reading it. Moss, seated next to her, listened and nodded. A Department of Family Impact sounds really good, he mused. Next up, stirrings of hope. The 2 weeks since Zylstra, do I have that? I'm still wondering about it. Zylstra first raised the possibility of a truce had been turbulent for Hambly, the board, and the entire county. In late November, the 57-year-old Democrat called Hambly to discuss a matter related to the fight over the health department budget and the Ottawa food program. After a few minutes, the conversation shifted to the negotiations with the board over her future. I'm feeling hopeful, he told Hambly. Why? Hambly replied, what's there to be hopeful about? Zylstra understood her pessimism. There had been stretches in the summer and fall when he'd felt he couldn't talk to Moss and the other conservatives on the board outside their regular meetings. He worried that they might take his words out of context and use them against him. That's a good worry. The strains, he said, mirrored the county as a whole, which he described as broken, before pausing to reconsider. I don't want to say that, he continued. We're separated into parts. That's a different way of saying it. Yeah. The tension had also spread to his relationship with his sisters, who were strong supporters of Moss and his movement. Yet Zylstra also believed that there were reasons for optimism. The intervention by the courts had so far dissuaded the board from firing Hambly. Hundreds of citizens had rallied to support her and the health department. Shortly after the $4 million settlement collapse, Hambly's attorney, Sarah Howard, filed a motion asking a state circuit court judge to enforce this $4 million agreement, arguing that the two sides had reached agreement on the essential terms before the commissioners decided to back out. The board's lawyers countered that the deal hadn't been finalized and that the commissioners hadn't voted publicly to accept it. Both steps were required by law before the settlement was complete, they said. Let's see what the court has to say about that. Judge Jenny L. McNeil, who had been dealing with the case for much of the year, scheduled a January 19th hearing on the matter. In the interim, she urged the two sides to meet with a mediator to try to reach a deal. I think everyone, not just the parties, but the entire county, needs some resolution here, she said. Zylstra understood that the mistrust and anger in the county weren't going to be resolved by mediation or even the courts. The divisions were real and deep. Like many in Trump's Republican Party, Moss framed politics as a battle between good and evil. The national, but it's the nation's survival, that he says, was at stake. Compromise was a sign of weakness and corruption. His perspective had inflamed passions across the county and upended the way the board operated. We don't talk about whether we should plow the snow once or twice a day, Zylstra said. Those are not our fights. Our fights are much larger, which of course means he's abdicating all responsibility for actually operating the county, as these national wannabes often do. We've certainly had that battle here in Loudoun County long before we were making the news on a semi-regular basis. That was always an issue. And one of the first things I noticed upon moving here, when it was still a red county, it was increasingly the case that people were essentially auditioning for national office and were campaigning for local office on the promise of enacting a national agenda on a local basis. We'll ban abortion here in Loudoun County. And that didn't work out very well. Anyway, like many in Trump's, oh yes, right, we already read this part. They frame politics as a battle between good and evil, and of course, here he is being a national wannabe. But the past year and the standoff with Hambly had made it clear that there were limits to the board's power. Gee whiz, I can't believe that that's the case. Limits that even Moss was being forced to acknowledge. You know, we have a sound effect for that one.
That is not how this works!
Yeah, basically, that's not how this works, Joe. If you want to run for national office, the opportunity is there for you, but you can't pretend that Ottawa County's Board of Commissioners is the presidency. It's not. Zylstra thought that the court-imposed delay might allow emotions to cool. He believed that eventually the board and Hambly could be forced to recognize that their only viable option was coexistence. An uneasy truce, Zylstra called it. A trying year was drawing to a close, and this was Zylstra's hope for the next one. And that's actually the end of the article here, because we don't know. The hearing in front of the judge is yet to come sometime in mid-January. I think they said the 19th. It's a lot of courtroom action happening in January, both nationally and locally. But interesting to see the national reporter's perspective on the story we've heard so much about from Rosalyn MacGregor. And now we have more from Rosalyn. In case you thought that we would end on a high note here and we would all take Zylstra's approach to things. Well, I'm hopeful things can be resolved. We'll see. Very little hope sometimes for a really good resolution on some of these things. But in case you thought that it might be happening, that the rest of the Ottawa Impact members of the Board of Commissioners were in fact coming to understand that no, they aren't fighting a national battle or an international or universal battle of good against evil. They really need to focus on administering the county and being more reasonable in their approach and finding ways to peacefully coexist. Let me lay that to rest. No, they're as crazy as ever, and Rosalyn has more evidence of exactly why. And here it comes. Here's what they've been spending their time on. I guess they see the writing on the wall, maybe, that they might end up taking an L on the health department, so they were looking for something else to F up, and they found it.
Good morning, David.
Good morning, Rosalyn.
Today I have another segment about the crazy stuff going on in Michigan's Ottawa County after a panel of right-wing nut jobs took over the local county board of commissioners in January. Not satisfied with causing lots of legal battles over the 2021 COVID response in the county, commissioners are now entertaining a new proposal that would allow any county employee to legally carry a gun while on the job.
The solution to
Recently,
everything.
the Ottawa County Board of Commissioners Planning and Policy Committee considered the policy change and another that would reimburse county employees for fees related to obtaining or renewing concealed pistol licenses or CPLs.
That they have money for.
Under current policy, any county employee who possesses a firearm or other weapon while on duty or on county property but isn't authorized to do so can face disciplinary measures. The new proposal would allow any county employee to carry a weapon or firearm while on duty or on county property, so long as they follow state law while doing so. In a memo to commissioners, County Administrator John Gibbs wrote the reason for the policy change is that, quote, county employees must comply with applicable laws regarding possession of weapons, unquote. In Michigan, residents over 18 years old who are legally owning a registered firearm can openly carry the weapon. Residents over 21 years old who have obtained a CPL can carry a concealed pistol that is legally owned by them and registered. Some locations where the state forbids open or concealed carry include daycare centers, schools, bars, churches, and more. Some county properties, like the Juvenile Justice Institute, may also fall under state laws which make carrying a firearm unlawful. Ottawa County officials said they did not have a full list of county properties where state law restricts the ability to carry. The Ottawa County Board of Commissioners is led by the ultra-conservative majority faction called Ottawa Impact. Board Chair Joe Moss, who leads Ottawa Impact, can sometimes be seen with a pistol on his hip during board meetings at the county's Fillmore Complex in West Olive. Derek Mellott, a spokesperson for the Michigan Association of Counties, said it appears that Ottawa County would be the first county in the state to allow all employees to legally carry while on the job. Mellott said there may be a county that has already done it, but the organization has no record of it. Mellott's organization represents and works to support county commissioners across all 83 counties in the state. Ottawa County would also appear to be the first county in the state to reimburse county employees for CPL licenses. Administrator Gibbs said the new CPL reimbursement policy would attract employees and, quote, help keep Ottawa County safe. Given the importance of self-defense and that the scientific evidence shows that increases in CPL adoption result in decreases in violent crime, this policy will benefit the community and encourage county employees to engage in responsible, legal firearm ownership, Gibbs wrote. He did not cite what study he was referring to. So, David, maybe I'll have some gun fail news from West Michigan in the future for you.
Yes, maybe.
Here's to wishing all your listeners a chance to relax during this season of the year where the nights get a few seconds shorter each day. Back to you, David.
All right. And, well, hopefully no one in the county will light up the night with accidental gunfire as they go on about their daily business as county employees, but with guns on. So that should be real fun and interesting that they found money in the budget. They're so tight on the budget, and we don't know exactly how we're going to, affect this or implement this settlement with the health department without affecting our bond rating. But everybody who wants to get a concealed carry license and then carry their gun on the job for the county will be paid back for that. No, of course, individual responsibility involved in that one. They want to encourage people to do this or say that that's a great benefit of working for the county. If you come to the county, I mean, I don't know how much it costs, probably not all that much. And so it's not going to affect their bond rating. It's, silly to think that it would, but it's just interesting that they managed to find money in the budget for that one. Whereas they could say, well, if you want to protect yourself from, of course, imminent Al-Qaeda attack on Ottawa County, Michigan, or whatever the case may be. I mean, everybody's in danger of gun attack these days, thanks mostly to policies like this one and the people behind it. But, what can you do? They don't acknowledge their responsibility in ending the food program, and they don't acknowledge their responsibility in the gun department either. So that's never going to happen. But, just interesting that I can't see very many people saying, well, I mean, I guess I could see people saying, well, it's free, so what the hell, I'll go and get one. I already own a gun, and I guess I kind of want a concealed carry license or whatever, so I might as well do it for free. I don't know if it's really going to be bringing employees in. I doubt that very much. Anyway, just another place in which they have once again decided that, I wish I was running for president. I wish I was a national Republican instead of a state and local one. But this is the level that a cuckoo bird like me can actually get elected, minus the presidency, apparently. And, so I'll have to settle for that. But that doesn't mean I can't cosplay as a gun-toting national legislator. I can pretend I'm Murdery Trader Green, or at least for the time being, Lauren Boebert. Anyway, I just thought that was an interesting update, and it's always interesting to get an update from Rosalyn MacGregor, who we have to credit her for making us aware of the happenings in Ottawa County well before. Usually we say that listening to the show or reading Daily Kos back in the olden days was like getting the newspaper early. This is, or a day early. This is like getting the newspaper a year early. And, of course, all it took was getting the right newspaper. The local papers in Michigan will suffice.
Hi, I'm Scott Anderson, the guy that writes the daily summary for this show, Kagro in the Morning. Thank you to everyone that supports this show. Many of you send donations through PayPal, Patreon, Square Cash, Radio Public, and so on. Some of you write your own essays and send them in, or read articles with your own commentary. We appreciate it. Now, some of you are listening to this and thinking, I'd like to help, but isn't there something I could do that wouldn't require money or effort? Why, yes, there is. You can just like us. On Daily Kos, they call it the recommend button. YouTube has a thumbs up. There are hearts and likes and love buttons. Tap our love button. Tap our love button every day. Share our shows and summaries on Facebook and Twitter, YouTube and iTunes, Stitcher and Amazon. Most of these places allow you to write a review, so a sentence or two would be great. Recommend us to social media, or tell your friends to listen to the show. You aren't just helping us, you're helping them find their new favorite thing to listen to. You could change the world. So thank you in advance from me and everybody else in the world.
All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. We got one more segment in this entire year. Of course, we'll come back next year. But the point is, what do we want to try to squeeze in to the last segment before calling it quits for a long weekend? And the answer is, man, there's just so much. And some of it I don't even know because it's in pocket behind inscrutable non-illustrations of what's in the. But there's definitely some that jump out at me. And definitely some that would be good to share on any normal day. But this is no kind of a normal day. I don't know. So let's see. There's at least two things that touch on familiar topics, but from a different angle. And I might be able to squeeze them both in. But if not, which is the most important? Geez, I don't know. All right. Well, let me try this one. We'll do this one because I think is I don't know. I don't know whether this will develop into a story. Normally, this would be, again, a huge story, a huge scandal. But because it has to do with Trump and mere pecuniary corruption, it's, probably going to fall by the wayside, but it's a real thing. It's reported in Rolling Stone. It is reported by Aswin Subsang, who, as it turns out, I think I went and looked at some videos of him being introduced in interviews, and I think we pretty much have the pronunciation about right. So, Aswin Subsang, I hope we haven't been doing you a disservice this whole time. But you can always pressure me to have you on the show, and then you could come on. But just for the purposes of clarifying the pronunciation of your name. We don't need any more information from you because we just read your pieces. Okay, well, we would be happy to have further insight. I don't know. Anyway, the point is he's reporting something that's of interest here. And it's, like I said, in Rolling Stone, Trump demands MAGA group give him millions. That's not legal, experts say. You can imagine how this would fall apart pretty quickly. Oh, that reminds me. There was another related development that was reported in, I thought, in one of this morning's big stories. I'm trying to think, was it the Maine thing or not? But somewhere in all of this coverage, let me just jump back to pocket for a second. Okay. Was it this? All right. No, it was this one, perhaps. Oh, yes. Right. Oh, gosh. There's so many things I have to get to. The big story of the morning being discussed widely today and yesterday that I'm not covering. I'm not covering for a strategic reason, but the reason is this. And by the way, this gives me an opportunity to bring up another approach to the subject. Okay, so this got sent to me by my brother Mark, who, by the way, you should all be sending positive healing vibes to, and without violating HIPAA, I think. Maybe we were violating it. I don't know. Don't sue. All right. Anyway, but he could use all the healing vibes. We won't get into specifics here, but he can really, really use them. So, in exchange for all these stories that he sends all the time, you enjoy those stories, right? Well, send your vibes. You've got some vibes somewhere, right? Vibes is a very big thing. All the kids are talking about vibes these days. Well, anyway, he's sent this story, which is important and much discussed today. I want to point out it's not new stuff largely. And yet, well, because of the news business, CNN is touting exclusive. And here's the headline. Recordings and emails, and I guess that's the new input here. Recordings and emails show how Trump team flew fake elector ballots to D.C. in its final push to overturn the 2020 election. And it's serious and important in the sense that it illustrates, again, the lengths to which Team Trump would go to overturn the election results, and with it, the democratic institutions of the United States of America. The new-ish angle on this is that this is kind of ironic, they've decided to fly copies of the fake elector certificates from, Michigan and Wisconsin to D.C. in order to try, they say, to guarantee that Mike Pence would have them in hand to pull off the evil plot that Mike Pence said he would not pull off, but they were trying anyway. And I guess the new twist is that they tried to do something extra to make sure that these certificates got in place. Now, longtime listeners to the show will know for quite a while now, since before they actually executed this thing, when we were just wargaming what could they possibly do to disrupt the election in September, October, November of 2020, we got to this idea of somebody actually came up with the idea ahead of time of, hey, maybe they'll try and even do fake elector certificates. They could absolutely try to do that. It sounds outlandish, but sure, why not? They'll do anything. And my big thing with that was, has anybody thought about how they're going to get them to the floor? Because they have to be read on the floor. Even if you get the vice president to want to do this, it's not at all clear that you're going to get them there, because the method of delivery is to mail them, I think by certified mail, but to mail them, the Electoral Count Act actually mandates that they be mailed in a certain fashion, and where they go, et cetera, but at least one copy goes to the president of the Senate, in his ceremonial office there. But that presumably that they were processed by the mailroom, and then the employees of the Secretary of the Senate, and then they're presented to the vice president and then to the tellers in the joint session. And it was not at all clear to me that any of the employees in the mailroom or in the Secretary of the Senate's office or the clerk of the House or whoever handled them would say, yeah, sure, let's bring these to the floor, because they're fake. There's no real reason to believe that they were going to do that. And that wasn't the reason that they ended up coming up with this workaround. As it turns out, the irony in it was that apparently the certificates were stuck in the mail, for at least from Michigan and Wisconsin, which is pretty amazing because they mailed them on time. And remember how much trouble we were having with the mail at the time? Pandemic issues, Louis DeJoy's undermining of the whole operation. And everybody thought, oh my God, what if my absentee ballot doesn't get here in time? What if it isn't delivered to the county board of elections on time? Maybe he's doing that on purpose, even in service of Trump, who knows? And then, as it turns out, one of the great ironies is that it was actually happening to the fake electoral college certificates of all things. Anyway, as it turns out, further down in the story, you find out that the Wisconsin ballots, or was it the Michigan ballots? So, well, one of them actually, I think Wisconsin, actually made it on time to the post office anyway, or through the post office to the hands of the appropriate, if there are any appropriate people to handle these things, inside of the mailrooms in the Capitol, but not that they were going to bring it to Trump or to Pence, but they did get it. Anyway, they hatched a scheme to fly extra copies and hand deliver them. But like I said, it's not news. Remember, this was all supposed to fall apparently to Ron Johnson and Scott Perry, they thought, to hand deliver these things. So the new twist was that they were panicking and they were going to fly them in, and that maybe they were going to even charter a jet just to make sure that they could get this thing right, even though the whole thing was wrong. The other thing was that it turned out that there's some indication that maybe it wasn't Scott Perry's staffer, but another member of Congress from Pennsylvania who's named in here. But it's just, it's not that important that we dig this out until we find out that guy's under indictment too. But if I skim, maybe the name will pop out. But anyway, it wasn't Scott Perry, but wasn't it Mike something? And I don't even remember who it was going to be. But, it's good information, and it's evidence of conspiracy and national coordination. And it's interesting to get a behind the scenes view from, it turns out, Kenneth Chesborough. Chesborough is spilling the beans here and giving the additional behind the scenes color on how this is happening, and describing a split in the Trump camp as between those who were following the campaign lawyers and White House counsel and others, and those who were following, as it turns out, COVID-addled, drunk-ass Rudy Giuliani on the other. And the Giuliani camp was the one getting everybody in trouble. Oh, Mike Kelly. There's the other Republican from Pennsylvania, member of the House, who actually helped shuttle the documents, as they say, along with Scott Perry, or maybe instead of Scott Perry. But anyway, you remember all this. This is where Ron Johnson was saying, well, I might have helped, but I only helped for a few seconds. I was only involved for a few minutes. I only murdered him for a second, Your Honor. You have to let me go. That's no kind of excuse. Anyway, it's kind of interesting. And it is in the news, but the facts of the matter, it really doesn't matter very much whether they fly the things in by hand to deliver them or mail them. The fact is that they forged them, and that's the problem. But it does show how committed they were to the conspiracy, and that could be of help at some stage as well. And there are other interesting details. So you should absolutely read the piece, but I wanted to spend the time instead on these other things. But one of the, now I remember, one of the items in the CNN reporting was that, I guess when there was some issue of how are we going to pay for all of the things we want to do in this, the tickets to fly to DC or to charter a jet or whatever, there's some mention in here somewhere. And I wish I had highlighting ability in Pocket. I would have done this. But at some point, there is an offer and maybe even an actual payment from a MAGA related, a pro-Trump super PAC of one kind or another offers to pick up the tab for all of this, which they don't really comment on it very much in the article. But I mean, that jumped out at me as like, well, what's the one thing we know about all the super PACs is that they're not supposed to coordinate their efforts with the campaign. And not only are they coordinating their efforts with the campaign, they're coordinating efforts in an illegal effort by the campaign, which even if it was a legal effort, it would be illegal for the super PAC to pick up the tab on all of this, but it's an illegal one. So I guess it's doubly bad, and nobody mentions it. Here it is. The campaign booked and paid for Brown's flight. It's Mike Brown is a Trump campaign official, was it? Not the other Mike Browns in history, but another one, but it's a common name. Anyway, they booked and paid for the flight on Southwest Airlines, the campaign did. Then it says, federal campaign finance records indicate that a pro-Trump super PAC paid the airline on the day of Brown's flight for travel related to election recount efforts. That's how they disguised it. But wow. Okay. So if the campaign, though, booked and paid for it, What was the opportunity for the Trump super PAC to pay? I'm not sure. So, maybe there's some confusion in the reporting. I don't know, but I guess something to look into. But that was by way of introducing another attempt at making illegal payments that inure to the benefit of Donald Trump from out of, if not a super PAC, then another outside group. And here's the story that Aswin Subsang had reported for Rolling Stone. Remember, Trump demands MAGA group give him millions. That's not legal, experts say. Here's the story. We'll read it as quickly as possible. His former aide has been making bank off his name, and he wants his cut right now. At least that's how former President Donald Trump sees it. It's my effing money, the 2024 Republican presidential frontrunner privately vented in October, referring to an alleged sum in the tens of millions of dollars. A source with direct knowledge of the matter tells Rolling Stone Trump wasn't talking about a business deal, not a traditional one anyway. Rather, he's been grumbling about money donated to a think tank that his former staffers and allies founded in 2021 to, quote, advance the America First agenda. For several months now, according to 3 people with knowledge of the situation, the former president has complained to an array of confidants and Republicans about the millions raised by the America First Policy Institute, a MAGA-fied think tank launched near the start of his post-presidency. The nonprofit is populated by several former high-ranking Trump administration officials, including Larry Kudlow, Rick Perry, and Linda McMahon. And it's led by Brooke Rollins, who served as a top White House domestic policy aide to Trump. AFPI is one of several Trump-aligned organizations and think tanks working to craft an intellectual framework. I guess I would have put that in scare quotes, for hardline policies ranging from voter crackdowns to potentially invading Mexico, because why not? If, in the ex-president's mind, though, Rollins was making a killing off of his name, sources recount, he gets mad about that, and was stiffing Trump. It's not right, the former president has groused in recent months. Well, duh. It actually is right. But anyway, doing what Trump has privately suggested, just giving him the money that they raised or a cut of it, would raise several legal issues. 4 experts told Rolling Stone AFPI is a tax-exempt educational nonprofit, and even that's questionable, and is expressly barred under IRS rules from spending money on elections or donating to political candidates like Trump. Of course, he doesn't really want that. He just wants a straight payout. Given that Trump is a candidate for office, paying him personally could be seen as attempting to aid a political campaign. Although it would be ironic, he could argue in court, no, that's the way to absolutely guarantee that the money doesn't reach the campaign. Give it to me personally, because I'm not going to put a dime of my own money into this campaign. Sure, that was my platform in 2016, but so what? I'm a huge liar, don't you know? This is all about embezzlement. I was going to embezzle that money, not spend it on my campaign. I'm not guilty. Oh, well. Anyway, yes. So one of the experts pointed out that the tax-exempt nonprofits must also operate for the public benefit in order to actually be entitled to this tax-exempt status, and they cannot disproportionately benefit private individuals or pay them more than fair market value for their services. And Trump has provided no services to them whatsoever. Though they could claim that he did, and that's probably what he wants. Do it that way, then. I don't even know if she would legally be allowed to give him all that money, to be honest with you, says a person close to the former president. It's not like Rollins got caught selling a bunch of knockoff Trump ties. The unrealistic and likely unwarranted complaints underscore Trump's efforts to determine which operatives and groups would hold sway in his future administration, as well as concerns about his soaring legal costs related to 4 indictments, plus accusations of fraud, sexual misconduct, defamation, and more. For years, the former president has also been viscerally sensitive to any sign, real or imagined, that somebody is raising money off of his image or name without his explicit permission. It's unclear if Trump actually knows the total amount of what AFPI has raised over the 2 years, or over the years rather. But in different conversations this year with close associates, Trump has alternately claimed it's anywhere from tens of millions to as much as $60 million. Now, AFPI's tax filings show that the group reported $38 million in revenue from 2021 and 22, or the tax year maybe, spanning those two. Trump has stated his belief that the money is held in an account by Brooke, as he just refers to her. It's Rollins, of course, but her first name is Brooke, and that she can easily transfer it to him personally if she wanted to do so. I thought I would read that very awkwardly just to make it more fun. In some of his discussions on the topic, Trump has said that he's willing to settle for just half of the haul, two of the people with knowledge of the matter say. He's suggested that he'll let Rollins off easy and she can keep the rest of the cash. Like, he has no idea, like, what she's doing with it. Neither do we, really, but, you know. It's just interesting that his default assumption is they're not doing any policy. They're just raising the money using the Trump name and then paying themselves. And it might even be true. He might be onto something, but it's still, we'll use the same clip again.
That is not how this works!
And I'm very impassioned about that. This has become such a common complaint from Trump that members of his campaign staff, longtime political allies, attorneys advising him, media pals, GOP lawmakers, and former elected officials have all heard about it from Trump, according to 3 sources. The grievance baffles some of Trump's associates. I mean, it shouldn't baffle you. He's mentally incompetent. And he's never been able to tell the difference between personal possession, personality, things that are his own property, and things that are government property, things that are business property, business-owned assets, etc. If there's cash, why can't you just give me half of it? Well, he never understood that, or at least pretended never to understand it. And it all demonstrates how warped the former president's understanding is of money, organization, and the law, which, for a brilliant businessman turned president of the United States is kind of a shortcoming, if you ask me. Trump has at times asked if the lawyers should get involved in his supposed financial matter with Rollins and AFPI. I said that was a bad idea. One of the people who Trump discussed this with bluntly says, to be clear, there's no real reason the think tank should give Trump cash, and there are obvious legal reasons for it not to do so. The sources add that Trump has been consistently, gently told that it's not Rollins's cash, but money raised for a nonprofit group. No matter how many times this has been explained to the former and possibly future leader of the free world, he apparently refuses to accept the logic. He fires back that the only reason the think tank and other MAGA-friendly groups get so many donations is because of Trump's name and my brand, and therefore he's entitled to a substantial cut. When contacted by Rolling Stone, Trump campaign spokesperson Stephen Chung emailed a blanket denial in response to the details of this reporting. None of these conversations ever happened. And these sources who pretend to speak for President Trump clearly have their own agenda, so they've fabricated elaborate stories to make it seem like they know what's going on, he said. America First aligned organizations exist because of President Trump and the movement he created, and we look forward to their continued work, which is really to say that he thinks Trump is entitled to that money, but he's afraid to say it because it's actually illegal. Anyway, Mark Lauder, AFPI's chief communications director, wrote in an email, "This story is typical fake news and is easily disproven with the simple fact in the past 3 years, President Trump has headlined a half dozen events for AFPI, including our Hispanic Leadership Conference in Miami, his first return trip to Washington, D.C., the big tech lawsuit, and 3 fundraising events at Mar-a-Lago. Oh, he said Mar-a-Lago. Mar-a-Lago as recently as last month, which I guess, he's trying to say, well, see, he's been raising money for us, so that he knows that we're a separate organization and he's happy for us to have the money. Although it proves no such thing, it's not at all incompatible to say that, well, he headlined these fundraisers for us. Well, yeah, because he thought that he was going to get 50% of the money. That's, That's just on the record. He says that. Or 3 sources say that he said that. That's true. We have to acknowledge that. Now, AFPI's board of directors includes several mega donors to Trump and the GOP. McMahon, remember her, who chairs AFPI's board, served as an administrator of the U.S. Small Business Administration under Trump. During the 2020 election cycle, she helmed a pro-Trump super PAC. Yes, pro-Trump super PAC. America First Action. Trunk, whatever, and poured $16 million into the group. And now Trump is saying, give me that money. According to its 2022 tax return, AFPI's board has included Florida Scientologist Trish Dugan, who previously donated $9 million to America First Action and gave $5 million to another pro-Trump outside group this year. Goya Foods CEO Robert, what's his name? Unanue? Maybe. A director on the AFPI board and 2020 election denier, by the way, donated $100,000 to the Trump Victory Committee during the 2020 campaign. That actually was a campaign donation. Florida businessman Mark Pentecost. Boy, you got Pentecostals and you got Scientologists. Was a new addition to AFPI's board in 2022. While Pentecost has little history of political giving, in 2021, his family foundation donated $10 million to a Georgia church whose senior pastor previously served as an evangelical advisor to Trump, according to research provided by the progressive watchdog group Accountable.us. And there are links there, but we don't have time to click through all of them. Although I am wondering, is the senior pastor, what's her name? No, it's a different one. Pastor Jentesen Franklin, Jentezen Franklin from MGM Ministries. I didn't even realize there was an MGM Ministries, but probably stands for something else, but weird nonetheless. Anyway, Pentecost's multi-level marketing company has pitched quote-unquote skinny coffees, whatever they may be, and other weight loss products to young women on TikTok. A Business Insider report last year calls the products scientifically dubious and potentially dangerous, just so you know. Other AFPI board members include Texas oil tycoons Tim Dunn and Cody Campbell, as well as informal Trump advisor and former House Speaker Newt Gingrich. Yay! Trump is fuming over the millions and millions raised by AFPI, and that has helped chill his relationship with Rollins, his one-time senior aide, this year. It also adds to the list of reasons why the ex-president and his campaign lieutenants now view AFPI and other allied right-wing operations with growing resentment and caution. How come their disarray can't sink them? 8 of Trump's former cabinet members and 20 former White House senior staff joined AFPI to promote the America First policies proven, well, not really, to help, not really, all Americans, not really, and stop the horrible damage done to our country, not really, by Joe Biden's administration. This is them speaking, of course. Those leaders, including Brooke, remain in constant contact with the former president and our friends who were advising them, said Lauder. And by the way, that's not even internally contradictory. He could absolutely be talking to them and have no idea. Oh, you're the ones that are stealing all the money? I can't believe it. Nobody told me this. All right. Well, anyway, this, according to Lauder, the AFPI's chief communications director, anyone who suggests otherwise shows little actual knowledge, as evidenced by their fear to be identified and talking to Rolling Stone, a website with stage 5 Trump derangement syndrome. Okay. Now, at the heart of all this pettiness is the matter of who or what organizations will hold the keys to influence on personnel and policy decisions if Trump reconquers the White House next year. On the one hand, you have an assortment of groups composed of MAGA true believers and also establishment Republicans who are angling to shape the next GOP administration. On the other end is Trump's determination to not be handled or undermined, as he often complains he was during his first term, by the so-called old guard of his party who think they know better than a former game show host and TV celebrity does. These two spheres often align and agree. However, Trump and a number of his most dedicated policy diehards are trying to pre-bake a government in waiting that will look like his own wholly owned subsidiary rather than a constellation of independent departments. And the former president wants to send a clear message, roughly a year out from his expected rematch against President Joe Biden, to other party leaders and activists currently jockeying for influence. During Trump's post-presidency, AFPI has attempted to brand itself as a White House in waiting should he win in 2024, and indeed the group is one of several organizations and networks that are providing detailed blueprints for a possible second Trump administration and hoping to guide senior and mid-level hiring. In recent weeks, the leadership of Trump's presidential campaign has publicly cautioned these groups to ratchet it down. Despite our being crystal clear, some allies haven't gotten the hint. Susie Wiles and Chris LaCivita, two of Trump's top campaign advisors, said in a written statement in early December, "Let us be very specific here unless a message is coming directly from President Trump or an authorized member of his campaign team, whoever they may be. No aspect of future presidential staffing or policy announcements should be deemed official. Let us be even more specific and blunt. People publicly discussing potential administration jobs for themselves or their friends are in fact hurting President Trump and themselves." Actually, that wouldn't be a terrible way of running things. Trump, Wiles, and LaCivita added, is not interested in, nor does he condone selfish efforts by desk hunters. He endorses selfish efforts by himself, of course. The jabs were directed at various actors, but there was no question that a share of Trump and his staff's irritation was aimed right at Rollins and the AFPI, according to multiple advisors and sources close to the ex-president. As one Trump advisor succinctly tells Rolling Stone at the end of this 20-minute tirade, the thing AFPI and all of them need to remember is you are not running the show. Donald J. Trump is running the effing show. And, of course, all of that is aimed at saying, well, Donald J. Trump should be given the effing money that they have raised to try to actually do something completely different. But, he's just looking to embezzle funds from any source possible. Okay, that precludes our discussion of the other thing I thought I might want to try to end the show with, but we can save it for next week. We are, after all, coming back next week. And Justice Putnam follows us here on Netroots Radio with his regular Friday program. And here comes today's edition of the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. What's he got on tap? Jack Smith's efforts to block Donald Trump from spreading disinformation in court is explained. Then on the rest of the menu from around the country and around the world, we can sample one more thing. How about a new Oregon law requiring data brokers to register with state agencies before selling personal information? Good idea.
Listening to Kagro in the morning with David Waldman.
Let's see what's international on today's show. A Russian poet, received a 7-year prison sentence for reciting verses against the war in Ukraine. And you know how that can go over there. And you'll never believe it, but another rich-ass oligarch Russian lawmaker has been found dead after another one of those convenient multi-story falls out a window. My.